Joining me now live to discuss the day's news is Ben Oquist from the Australia Institute and Renee Gorman from the Institute of Public Affairs. Great to see you both. Let's get straight into it. Let's start with this quarantine breach where two international travellers managed to skip quarantine in Sydney. They then boarded a flight to Melbourne. Ben, both of them has tested negative, but New South Wales police have come out in the last few hours saying that it was actually them to blame. They incorrectly allowed the pair to proceed to Melbourne. Is that good enough?
Yeah, I heard the police fess up to say that a couple of the officers had been told by the passengers that they had a connecting flight and so were led on, and the wrong paperwork was discovered in Victoria. No, it's not good enough, and lessons are being learnt, and I heard the police say they're already putting in new practices. But mistakes will happen. That's the nature of a virus that has resulted in lockdowns and quarantines and borders, that holes will occasionally be found, and the best thing is to learn the lessons from that. I heard Dan Andrews on this topic today sounding very measured, not getting stuck into New South Wales, not getting stuck into the Commonwealth, who after all are responsible for borders with the rest of the world, but saying it's important we learn the lessons, and that if mistakes could be made there, they could be made anywhere. I was struck by Dan Andrews' conciliatory tone and a little bit less buck shifting and finger pointing, and a bit more problem solving will keep Australia in the great place that it's been put by putting health first. As Greg Hunt said this morning, a combination of leadership and health advice is keeping Australia safe, and ultimately, of course, being of benefit to the economy, because it's only with an effective health response that you can have a strong economy over time.
Absolutely, and you're right, mistakes will be made. But Renee, what do you think that this says about Australia's border controls?
Well, I do have to say one of the things that's refreshing about this case is the openness and transparency from the New South Wales Police Force to fess up to this mistake so early on and so quickly. That kind of openness and transparency would be great to see reflected by other leaders such as Daniel Andrews, who should really be looking at New South Wales as an example of how to handle this pandemic. And yes, it's true that mistakes like this will happen, but what state governments do need to realise is that these mistakes will happen and they need to prevent them, but also that they have to have the best systems on the ground to be able to deal with them when they do happen, such as New South Wales' gold standard for contact tracing, which every state should be trying to emulate, including Victoria, which seems to be a little bit behind on the tracing stakes. Because effective contact tracing systems mean that we do not have to needlessly lock down the economy when we have an outbreak of, say, 1 or 2 cases. So they are incredibly important moving forward.
Yeah, but good to see, though, Victoria moving forward with restrictions easing from tomorrow. So that's certainly a positive there. Let's move on to the big news of the week, the deteriorating relations between China and Australia. Ben, how would you describe that relationship between the two right now?
Well, it's the worst in living memory, and we need to do something about it. Now, there's obviously fault on both sides. China is a brutal regime with a terrible human rights record. You don't need to tell people in Tibet or Xinjiang about that, and they also play their foreign affairs in aggressive and assertive manner. We've seen wolf warrior diplomacy. They're a growing big power that's going to assert its might, and Australia has to learn how to deal with that. And diplomacy is not always about who's right. It's about being diplomatic and getting the right response to get you the right outcome over time. Australia has to face the fact that China's a growing influential power, and we need a strategy to deal with it. Now, I think Scott Morrison got the tone wrong this week. He spoke too quickly and with emotion, and diplomacy needs something better. And that's not to say he shouldn't have spoken, but I think to have held that press conference in the Lodge within 45 minutes of that tweet going up and been angry and emotional about it, probably got the wrong tone right and took Beijing's bait. Australia needs a long-term diplomatic strategy to deal with China, and it doesn't look like we've got one at the moment. We need a reinvestment in public diplomacy, Australia's foreign aid and trade and aid budget has been slipping. Only 1.3% of our budget is spent on foreign affairs and trade and aid, and used to be 1.9%. It was 9% after the Second World War.
Yeah.
So big reinvestment in diplomacy befitting of a country the size and the scale of Australia. One last fact. Chile, Greece, Portugal all have many more diplomatic posts than Australia does overseas, despite having lower populations, only about 20% of Australia's GDP. As a mid-power, we're not a superpower, but we're not nothing. We need a much more activist foreign policy and a reimagining of our diplomacy.
I guess that the hardest part in this diplomacy as well is that China doesn't appear to be answering the phone. Australia said it's reached out many times and they're not getting the phone call back. Renee, in terms of the strategy, like Ben mentioned just then, is it working to fix the problem with China? What needs to be done here?
Well, I think that Scott Morrison's response was completely reasonable, and that Australia had the right to be angered by such an outrageous and offensive tweet. And that has been backed by the international community, and the international community is now, hitting back on China. There seems to be a silly discussion that comes up with our relations with China every now and then about somehow a change in tone or nuance would fix the situation, as if authoritarian regimes are really just after nicer words and tone. And I think any kind of argument around that should have been thrown out the window as soon as we saw the list of 14 grievances from China about Australia, because it effectively was a list of 14 things that China does not like about Australia being a free and democratic country. And anyone who wants to have this discussion about how a change in tone or how some nuance could fix this relationship, well, they need to get down to the brass tacks of it and look at this list of 14 grievances and say which of these they would be willing to sacrifice in order to please China. Would they be willing to sacrifice our free press to please China? Would they be willing to sacrifice the freedom of speech of our members of parliament to please China? Because that is what this discussion comes down to in the end. And really, I don't think that China expects Australia to give in on any of these 14 grievances. In reality, this is a warning list to the rest of the world, to other countries, a list of foreign policies that if China sees them, they may punish economically. And we cannot give in to these kind of bullying tactics when it comes to an authoritarian regime like China.
Yeah, and I guess it raises questions too about Australia's reliance on China moving forward. Let's move on now, because Australia is dropping plans to use Kyoto credits to meet Paris climate targets. Ben, this announcement is set to be made at a leaders' summit next week. Is that the appropriate way forward, do you think?
Yeah, what a great decision it will be, and let's hope we get that clear declaration from the Prime Minister on the 12th of the 12th. We were meant to be having the next big international climate summit in Glasgow this month, but it's been deferred by a year, and in a sense this ambition summit replaces that, and countries are asked to come along with new commitments because the climate crisis is getting worse, and unless there's more action from all countries, including Australia, the world is headed for climate catastrophe. And the destruction of species, habitats, our economy, our way of life in many places within the lifetimes of many people watching. So unless new action is taken at that climate summit and beyond, the world's going to be a very dangerous place. So good on Scott Morrison for coming forward and cancelling those dodgy Kyoto credits. There'll be time for criticism of Australia's other policies later on. We're all going to have to do a lot more at state and Commonwealth level in Australia and around the world. But congratulations to the Prime Minister for dropping those dodgy credits, if that's what comes to pass at that Climate Ambition Summit.
Renee, your thoughts on this? Is this to be applauded by Scott Morrison, as Ben said?
I don't think so. I think Australia needs to be incredibly cautious right now about overly ambitious targets that will hamper the Australian economy, especially now of all times when, as already discussed, the Australian economy is at threat due to trade relations with China. The economy is already hurting because of COVID-19. I think the lines in the political sand are becoming incredibly clear in Australia, and it comes down to who is willing to sacrifice Australian jobs and the Australian economy to what is effectively virtue signalling, because Australia will have no net impact on global temperatures, and who is not willing to make that sacrifice and put Australia first. The coalition government, in my opinion, needs to make it very clear that they are on the side of jobs. Let's not forget that this coalition government miraculously won the election that was dubbed by the left as the climate election. So I think they need to be learning from the response from that and reflecting what the Australian people are really concerned about right now, which is the economy and jobs, and not virtue signalling to global interests just to make ourselves feel good.
Well, I guess as we head into the final sitting week of Parliament, there'll be more on this. Unfortunately, we have to leave it there. Ben Oquist and Renee Gorman, great to chat. Thanks for joining me.
Janika, thanks, Renee.
Thank you for having me.
The bottom 20% get nothing. They're really unfair tax cuts.
People want to see much stronger action from the government when it comes to climate change.
Wages are growing at their slower, sustained pace.
Transitioning to net zero emissions, it doesn't seem like there's much room for gas.